Over the past, say, month, there has been an uptick in the effects of violence in the West, in the first world. And this is particularly true of America, because in America there has been at least two instances of, we could call it political violence. One was a random attack against a Ukrainian refugee, where an African had slashed her throat, and normally this would be front page news only of a local paper, but because there was footage that was released, it became a bit of a national sensation. And then the second one being the assassination of Charlie Kirk, who's a voluble, or was a voluble American pundit, or political debater, maybe you could call him. Apologist, at least, for the soft Christian right base of Trump's band. Now, the effects of these two things have riled up American discourse, rhetoric, particularly online, but also in reality to some degree, where there's a hope maybe from both sides on the pushing of the something happening button. Because you've been stuck in a stasis and stagnation for so long, it becomes very tiresome and weary to have something happen against you negatively and not be able to react with anything. So maybe two parts of this video, I'll uncover the why of that. Why is it that Americans are not doing anything, and what are they waiting for? And then secondly, it'll be on what the whole idea around violence should be, because I think on both sides, it's not that you should celebrate violence. It's much more around your reaction to something violent happening says a lot about who you are. If you are aghast that something violent, especially politically, has happened to a political person, you are very naive and moronic. If you thought that this was a peaceful affair, you could go out and just casually discuss these things and debate these things as if they weren't life or death for someone, then you're being ignorant. Not that you deserve to be killed, but it should be less surprising that those people who involve themselves politically are targets for political violence. It makes definitional sense. Now, once again, you don't condone necessarily this or that. It's much more your reaction to a violent attack, something happening that you should be reflecting on. And so I'll walk you through a little bit of that. Georges Sorel, who was a French syndicalist, he wrote Reflections on Violence, which was quite an interesting book around the idea of violence and revolution in particular. His view and point was obviously communistic, to say the least, but in general it provides some quite unique insights on why violence is the preliminary and de facto mechanism by which change is implemented. The ballot box just is insignificant in the face of actual concerted, coordinated, and this is strategically goal-orientated violence. That's, say, a subset of war in total, but some form of war, not just me being violent to someone else or someone being violent to me, but in a political violence sense. Now, the first quote here I'll just read is a short one by Sorel. In the eyes of the contemporary bourgeoisie, everything is admirable which dispels the idea of violence. Our bourgeoisie desire to die in peace. After them, the deluge. You can see here the sentiment, obviously, that if you have money, you have more to lose. And to give you this idea baked in a reality you can probably at least sympathize with, is the IRA. The IRA is was an Irish terrorist cell, which was responsible for many attacks both in Ireland and the United Kingdom broadly around Irish independence. And you can see here, this little chart, the orange line here, how many attacks there were per annum, and it hovered somewhere between 100 and 200 for what was nigh on 2 decades. Then after the ceasefire and the Good Friday Agreement, it dropped off to much more insignificance. So you can see the reality here is that the appetite for violence on both sides is probably expired or expunged. Now, what I would relate this to, and this may not be the linear causality, but you can see here the GDP per capita of Ireland, and I've tried to overlay them at the same time periods. When there's the tumultuous periods of violence in Ireland, you have very poor populace, and so you have an instinctual understanding that young men have very little to lose, and thus will try to fight for, say, ideas, or they'll try to fight for status, recognition. Something around their identity becomes a manifest form of a movement. And in that, you can see that having very little material wealth contributes quite highly to a violent strain. Not always, but definitely it's a precipitating factor to extreme violence in a political sense. Most revolutions have taken place in an environment where there is a strong material imbalance between the wealth of, say, an upper crust and the lower canaille. The second quote I'll read you here is just from Carl Schmitt, who he wrote quite a lot, obviously extensively, on the political theory, and this is from Concept of the Political. He writes, "The domain of exchange has its narrow limits and its specific categories, and not all things possess an exchange value. No matter how large the financial bribe may be, there is no money equivalent for political freedom and political independence. State and politics cannot be exterminated. The world will not become depoliticized with the aid of definitions and constructions, all of which circle the polarity of ethics and economics. Economic antagonisms can become political, and the fact that an economic power position could arise proves that the point of the political may be reached from the economic as well as from any other domain." I think it's important just to understand here that economics has become political rather than, say, vice versa. Politics is subsumed by economics. So what we understand, at least out of this, is that the more and more largesse we have, the bulking out of the populace from a wealthy sense, and you can see that GDP per capita has a significant proportion of people now living what is the best version of their material reality. They can buy whatever they want, they can travel wherever they want, they can afford to do the things that they think are satisfying to them, or they enjoy, or they make them happy. All of these things are now within their grasp of just working a little bit more. So your 9-to-5 job, earning your salary, going home, and then divvying up your budget into what things you want to purchase. This is the state of affairs, particularly for one generation that we like to call the boomers. And the boomers here, and you can see with the, just from an American sense, that they own what easily is about 60% of the wealth of the planet, or of the USA wealth, which is the only country we really care about here. And it's reflected in all other Western societies anyway. So the baby boomers are by far the largest asset owners, and they have thereby the most to lose economically. The destabilization of their economic wealth is very important for them in terms of not wanting it to happen. So what they'll try to do is assuage everyone with the one thing they have to offer, which is money. And that's why you can see the money politics working effectively throughout the last 2 decades. It's because the more money boomers earned, the more they tried to spend to continue the trajectory, their trend here, apace on earning more money, because it became very apparent to them that they could just earn more money with the right incentives, the right implementation of policy, social policies. More immigrants, well, more money for me because I have cheaper slaves and I am able to afford more things, and I'm able to get a promotion, and now I have 50 immigrants under me, and I can call myself a VP or director. This is a very strong strain of the mentality that the boomer has and continues to operate under, as if this is the de facto of the social political environment. This has always been the case, is because of the near-term thinking humans go through. It's very hard to remember how bad things have ever been. So you go this understanding, and this is why, as a society, we are out of form. It's why violence shocks us. It's because we become so inured to any disruption of our social balance, you call it. Which means that when you have this shock like this, something that happens, an aberration, something so unfathomable, unforeseen, shocks you into a point of, what do I do now? I don't know how to react to this. This means you're out of form. If you're a boxer and you get punched in the face, you know how to react. If you're a civilian who's never been punched in the face, you don't know how to react. It's something shocking to you. You go into fight or flight or freeze. And the idea then becomes a follow-up, an intellectual analysis of then what do we do? So rather than reacting in a age-old fashion of violence begets violence, and this is very meaningful because violence is a problem solver, it's the ultimate problem solver, then you will get the analytical version of how do we boomerize everything from here? How do we make sure that nothing is disrupted materially? So you'll see, and this is particularly true for Trump, who himself is a boomer, he'll try to use the law. Now, the law is the shield upon which our enemies will falter because everything they do can be considered a crime. And as long as you have the charges, then you're able to arbitrate the consequences for these actions. The problem becomes obviously that if you punish a team or a side or an ally or a friend or an enemy, so much so with the same instruments that they one day can hold themselves, guess who's going to be on the other end of that whip? So you run this, rather dangerous game here, gamut, where if you are successful, your enemy is quashed and then you have no worries. If you are unsuccessful, and this is when the idea of ethics is attributed to politics and Machiavelli obviously advocated for this, you have to be rid of your enemies in a totality. It has to be so historically written and printed that they're never actually considered alive again. You root and stem, you salt the earth. This is the type of behavior that is required to quash a political insurrection backed on an ideology, particularly one that's more fervent and vital, youthful. Ideologies for boomers is money. Money is an ideology for them, the American dream. This is not energetic. This is not vital. It's got no vim. So no one's really prepossessed. They're not enthusiastic about defending this idea with their life. No one wants to go to war necessarily for that. Is it a combination of factors around that you go for war, like your family and the honor of the United States? Yeah, of course. But if you said defend the right of a boomer to own 15 homes and 5 cars, you'll find very few people picking up the pick of war to swing at their enemy's face. I'll read you just one excerpt today from Spengler's Hour of Decision. It's a super fascinating tract, and if you have the time, I obviously recommend that you do read it. He goes on to say, party becomes the liberal substitute for rank and state. Revolution, in the form of periodic mass elections fought by all available means of money, brains, and even, after the Gracchian method, physical violence, is exalted into a constitutional process. Government, as the meaning and duty of state existence, is either opposed and derided or degraded to the level of a party business. But the blindness and cowardice of the liberalism goes further still. Tolerance is extended to the destructive forces of the city dregs, not demanded by them. In Western Europe, Russian nihilists and Spanish anarchists are gushed over in good society with revolting sentimentality and passed on from one fashionable hostess to another. In Paris and London, above all in Switzerland, both they and their undermining activities are carefully protected. The liberal press rings with maledictions of the prisons in which the martyrs of liberty languish, and not a word is dropped in favour of the countless defenders of the state, down to the simple soldier and policeman who are blown away into the air, crippled by bullet wounds, or slaughtered in the exercise of their duty. Now this points to the celebration of the weak versus the strong, and there's an adulation from the weak about other weak men doing weak-willed, nefarious and undermining activities. So if I'm an anarchist or if I'm a Antifa, then I'm going to go about violence in a way that's rather cowardly. I'll mask myself. I'll go at nighttime and try to slash the tires or try to shoot someone from a distance rather than going up and being brave about it. So this is the idea that you'll start to see, that violence is condoned by the left for the left's reasons in the way the left fashions violence. This is not what we traditionally would see as successful violence, because the left is incapable of a mass-produced revolt in this day and age around the idea of sacrifice to that. The left will brainwash kids into all sorts of things, including political violence, but they can't collectively brainwash themselves to be coherent around a certain ideology or dogma that they all follow unto death. It's much more around these, you could say, freak occurrences, aberrations in the stasis. So one person will do this randomly, the one person will do this randomly, and you can see the trend. You can see that there's a consistent aberrational trend. The more people who are bound to the leftist ideology, you'll start to see by statistics, by the gradation of just data. So if you have quantity of data increasing, you're going to have the effects. If they're 1 in 100 and you've got 200, then it's 2 out of 200. So the size of the movement does matter from that respect. But if there was 300 million Americans who were leftists, they'd still be too much of a coward to go and do anything about the state of affairs. They'd still obey the law of elections, of the ballot box. It's pathetic. If you had a movement that was that strong, just take office by force. This is how they work. So you can see here that political motivated murders are on the rise, and as I explained, the resultant affair is one of, if you're a leftist, then you're more willing to commit these activities on your enemies, and this is not the reprehensible, unethical thing that the right tries to impute it. Violence just is. So to understand humans is to understand that the need for violence has always resided within us. We have the capacity for violence. Well, not a lot of us do actually anymore, but when we are genetic as a species, we have a capacity for violence. One of the biggest issues with Americans is they're mostly fat and lazy. And if you can see obesity as probably one of the spoils of war. So people are fatter because they're richer, but it is also the case that when you become fatter, sorry, my hair's going all sorts here. If you become fatter, then you're less likely to engage in energetic activities. How many soldiers in wars have been fat? Very few. And the ones that have obviously been strong fat. So they've been swinging hammers or something. Not lard ass can barely shuffle their way through Walmart. So the idea that you'll have a revolution backed by any of these people is nonsensical. You'll have an online experience where maybe tens of thousands of people will come to your aid and hit a like button. But if there were call to arms, if there was an actual movement pushed in the streets of let's take X building, let's take this, it's never going to happen with a bunch of fatties. They have no capacity for actual violence because the testosterone levels must be created. It's catastrophically low. But secondly, there's no organizational capabilities around fats. They just don't have the mental capacity, the stamina for these things. Can you experience privation? Would you be willing to go to jail? Would you sacrifice all these things, maybe unto death? No, I'd rather sit and eat myself to death if that's the options that I have. And that's what they'll continue to do. So fatness, which is endemic in America, and it's on both sides of the political spectrum, you could call it, but the right-leaning males of power will always tend towards the physical representation of this. I'm not saying Trump's your bodybuilding, god or idol or something like this, but you'll see that politicians running and almost never lard asses to that degree. Chris Christie was not able to even pull in like a single territorial vote in the runoff because he's fat and disgusting. No one wants to vote for something like that. This is a mockery of what a representation of a powerful man looks like, a glutton. Now you can be, I say, a respectable fat man. There have been many, say, merchants and businessmen who have been large and in charge, but this is a different element. This is a different domain in which they are able to operate in that way. But in general, and this is maybe as an aside, Americans are too fat for this right now. So if your movement wants to be successful, you have to look like brown shirts. You can't look like stretched shirts, if that's not too on the nose. Which goes into maybe another thing. So the material wealth has a second byproduct, which is that everyone becomes used to the felicity of living, and that it's very hard to get riled up to a degree where you can experience hate when all you experience is, say, ennui or apathy. So if you're apathetic about everything, you have this idea that effort is required to think and feel, whereas TV, podcasts, YouTube videos, doom scrolling on your phone requires very little energy, mental energy, and it doesn't require you to come out of your stasis. You can maintain that level. So if you have that as the notion that I don't want to risk anything because risks to me won't, say, be worth the reward. I don't think political upheaval, violence is necessary for me to continue to experience life as the way I want to live it. Then you won't. You're apathetic to this movement. You're ambivalent to any action that goes plus or minus in the directions because, oh look, I'll support you online. I might throw you a few dollars on Patreon or whatever those right-wing ones are. But the idea then becomes, if I disrupt this lifestyle of mine, then I'll have a problem. But if I'm able to continue as is, ceteris paribus, then I won't change a thing because I'm just apathetic towards that. If you cared enough about something, you would do something. If you cared enough about something political, you'd be willing to risk your life to do it. The end. If you have not accepted and grasped this notion, then there is no saving you because you just don't care enough. Now, if you're not willing to risk life and limb, then you're not really wanting that thing so much. And that's it. That's all there is to say. This is what this disastrous hustler culture actually gets right sometimes. If you wanted something bad enough, you would work until you got it. Now, potentially you never get it, but you wouldn't stop working because you'll find out whether or not you get it at the end, in death. Would you regret it? Sure. But as Kierkegaard says, you regret everything. Killing yourself, not killing yourself. You regret it both ways. So what's really the dilemma here is, do I think the reward is requisite to the payoff, to the effort? And that's the different question. That's a value, a Nietzschean value that you'll have on your own. So whether you can come to that conclusion. But power for its sake is worth it. Power, if it drives you extrinsically or intrinsically, is something that you should pursue. And power is always going to be a political game. It's always going to be that mechanism by which we derive our feelings of status. Whether our destiny is one of power or one of money is something you discover yourself. But if it is one of power, then politics is the way to do it. And then politics is the way to do it. Then you know that the methodology you're required to win power is set, and I've even said this in certain videos, around being popular, around being represented of ideas, but of people, and making sure that you know how to acquire power should you get to that certain level. Whether that is through the ballot box or through other means is determined by the state of play at the day. But in general, you have to have the understanding that at the moment, Americans feel as if they have too much to lose to bother with, say, large-scale political violence. And this is particularly true if your team's winning. If my team is Donald Trump, then I'm very satisfied because he's winning, and I feel as if he's representing me. And the more things he does positively, I continue to attribute to myself, and then I'm, rising in status just by issuance or by attribution to Trump himself. Whereas if I'm a Democrat at the moment, I feel as if I'm being kicked while I'm down, and that will start to make me seethe, and you'll see that the violent reactions are responding to that. Once again, if you are shocked by violence, this is something you need to fix. You're out of form. Humans have always been suffering violence for eons. The last 50 years, just because there's not been that much, and I'm talking about like gang violence in America or something, like being robbed and beaten, that's obviously going to happen. But political violence is a massive cornerstone of American foundational history. You had a huge civil war. You had two, basically. The founding of America was more or less a civil war, and then you've had one in the 1870s, 60s. So it is the case that the Americans are A, good at war, and B, used to it to some degree genetically or historically. How are you shocked by this? One guy gets shot in the throat, which is obviously a horrific way to see it and watch it. It was disgusting, but one guy gets shot in the throat and his upheaval of your life is completely turned. What were you expecting? Violent? There would be no violence in politics? That's embarrassing. Like the men of, if you're a man of the right, you're supposed to be the one who's, more used to violence, more used to power, not the squeamish little dandy. It's like, yeah, he was shot in the throat. Yes, it's disgusting. Yes, you can find it reprehensible. But if you're completely shocked and stunned that someone would go out and shoot someone they didn't approve of, or found themselves to be bigoted or xenophobic or whatever it was, the reasoning, I'm not too sure, then think about that personally for yourself. Am I really that shocked? Is it that upsetting, violence like that? No one likes watching someone die. With the internet, obviously, most people have watched something somewhere, and it can be unpleasant. But the idea that you'd be shot in the head for your political beliefs is a very historical fact. And this needs to be ingrained within you. I don't think you have to like it as much as you just have to. That's a reality of what the decision was. You go into politics, this is an outcome that can happen. How do you protect against it? Well, there are many mechanisms by which you can do that. You can ensure certain levels of safety of risk. And I would say he was obviously, Charlie, in this instance, even the Ukrainian refugee, obviously low on the risk assessment of their situation. She sat in front of 4 Africans. That was probably not a smart thing to do on public transport in the middle of the night or whatever it was. Charlie went to a university to talk, and a student or a young man at least shot him in the throat. So the idea that you would have an open, fair forum like that, where the ability to sit on a roof 100 yards away and shoot someone existed, it was extant. So whether he could have done more, potentially, but it's hard to blame him for it, but it's much more around, I don't think if you told him he was shot at one of his debates that he would be shocked by that. Say, maybe that was one of the risks I was willing to take, which is what a strong right man would do. That's the position you would want. You say, no, I'm going to continue to fight even though there is a risk of my own death and life. Plenty of EU politicians have put up with this for decades now against, say, Islamic extremists in Europe, where if you mock Muhammad, if you mock Islam in any way like that, they'll legitimately try to murder you. And they have 24/7 police patrols and subjugators surrounding them. So once again, the idea that politics was never going to be violent is just naive. Lastly, I'll leave you with one more from Reflections of Violence by Sorel. He says, and this is related to how we can continue to conceive of the political sphere now that violence has been reintroduced to us holistically, and you say very viscerally. Today, parliamentary socialists no longer believe in insurrection. If they still sometimes speak of it, it is to give themselves an air of importance. They teach that the ballot box has replaced the gun, but the means of acquiring power might have changed without there being a change of mental attitude. Electoral literature seems inspired by the purest demagogic doctrines. Socialism appeals to all the discontented without troubling itself about the place they occupy in the world of production. In a society as complex as ours and as subject to economic upheavals, there are an enormous number of discontented people in all classes. That is why socialists are often found in places where one would least expect to find them. Parliamentary socialism speaks as many languages as it has types of clients. It addresses itself to workmen, to small employers, to peasants, and, in spite of Engels, it aims at reaching farmers. At times it is patriotic, and at times it rants against the army. No contradiction is too great. Experience having shown that it is possible, in the course of an electoral campaign, to group together forces which, according to Marxist conceptions, should normally be antagonistic. Besides, cannot a parliamentary deputy of service to electors in every economic situation? And you can see this with modern representatives of leftists, and particularly in America, that means the Kamala Harris substitutes, and that could be AOC, it could be Gavin Newsom at the moment, even though I think he's probably more right-leaning than most people will be willing to admit, or himself is portraying as a bit of a charlatan, obviously, and I think he genuinely is a sociopath. But I would say that the idea then that you have a message built for everyone means you have a message built for nobody. So politically, I think you need to align yourself, understand that you have an ally and you have friends and you have an enemy. And in that, you can then constitute what is acceptable in the realm of political trajectory, of strategy, of ambit. Where do we want to go with the men that we have? And what kind of violence should we expect from trying to achieve those aims?